welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me as ever is Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshaw.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Today we're going to be discussing First World War and the cinema. And now I think our loose conceit is obscure films. And the films we've singled out are The Big Parade from 1925, the 1926 film The Better Ole, which I've not watched, Wings from 1927, Dawn Patrol 1938, which is a remake of a 1930 film, my favourite, Life and Death of Colonel Blimp from 1943, and finally The King of Hearts. Now, I wonder if our starting point is the misnomer of the fact that we're labelling these as obscure.
Yeah, there might be some very angry listeners. Like, how could you possibly refer to a film that's got Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone and David Niven in it as being obscure?
Or indeed Wings, which has a huge number of academic papers written about it. And
it's the first film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture.
I know that the famous tracking shot is all over Twitter. It pops up in my timeline sort of every few months. But I think it's this question of what do we mean when we're talking about popular and popular culture? Because these were hugely popular films in their day. But I think if you asked someone today, name a First World War film, I'm not sure any of these would be top of the list.
And I have to say, when you suggested Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, it jolted me to remember that actually a large chunk of it is about the First World War.
That's the thing. It's thought of as a Second World War film a lot of the time, which is why I wanted to include it on the list. It's not an obscure film in any way, but as a First World War film, I don't think it's necessarily thought of that way. Because
the other thing that struck me about Colonel Blimp when I started looking it up, I thought perhaps it was obscure at the time because it was lambasted by some of the media, and I think Churchill tried to suppress it. I think some of the background troops are actually Canadian, not English, because they weren't allowed to be used because it was perceived as being potentially anti-British. But the only thing that outperforms it that year in the box office is In Which We Serve and Casablanca. You know, Casablanca's massive. In Which We Serve, well, you know, you could take it or leave it, but it's certainly a big patriotic film. So it's third in the box office that year. So clearly it struck home somewhere. Does Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. And the Big Parade, it grosses 18 to 22 million worldwide.
Oh, it was huge in its day. Absolutely huge. But there are also fewer films coming out. So.
Well, indeed, but which leaves our outlier as King of Hearts as a popular film.
And of course, that's an outlier in the sense that it's, you know, we've been talking about Anglophone films, British and American films, and King of Hearts is French. It is, in fact, Waugh de Coeur. It's a film I adore. I was saying, you know, my mother introduced me to it because she was an Alan Bates fan. And yeah, I've always loved that film.
Because I watched it on YouTube, one of the comments for it, literally the first comment is, it's like watching an acid trip. And you know what? It's a hell of a thing to watch.
So the plot is Alan Bates is sent into it's kind of a rerun of Scoop. So they get the wrong man, don't they? They send a specialist in who's an ornithologist, or he's in charge of the pigeons to do demolition work, and the village has left, and the lunatics are left in the village, and Alan Bates picks up with the lunatics is essentially sort of the story behind it all.
You can see where they got the inspiration for Blackadder's Goodbyeee. It's an hour and 43-minute version of that episode. You know, the lunatics take over, and in the end, the conclusion is they're probably more sane than the people on the outside, quite literally on the outside of this walled village.
Because the lunacy just kind of radiates outwards. But I mean, you get little snippets. The guy, what's the name of the character that he's playing? Oh, well, the
Plumpick.
Plumpick, yeah, because he keeps calling him Pumpernickel, or the Scottish general or commanding officer keeps calling him Pumpernickel, and the whole thing starts off with like this very kind of slow burning farce. That then, when he arrives in the town, like there's a bear or there's an elephant or something like that wandering around, and just the whole thing becomes increasingly insane. and kind of that culmination of them, of the British and the Germans all lining up opposite each other just to shoot each other en masse. The whole thing is just, I loved it. I was great, but it's so bizarre.
At which point the lunatics decide that the other people are mad and decide to return to the asylum because the outside world's crazy.
Yeah.
Having decided that the British soldier is the king of England.
Well, no, the King of Hearts, I think, is the point.
The King of Hearts.
King of Hearts. But it's interesting that what struck me is it's 1966. It's also written to the backdrop of nuclear war. So you've got self-assured, you've got mass destruction, haven't you? Of mutual self-assured mass destruction, sort of ebbing on people's minds. And then it's sort of played out in front of you as well, linking it to the First World War. It's
so much of its time in so many ways, because it keeps on comparing social structures, and particularly 19th century French hierarchical social structures, with what's going on in the British and the German military. The French don't get a look in until right at the end. And I want Chris to talk about national stereotypes in a minute. But you've got, the brothel madam and the figures who are important in the society. There's the Duke and Duchess, who are the mayor and his consort of the town in this lunatic construction. But there's a general and a bishop of the cathedral. And then the brothel madam, who has this incredibly important role in the film. It's quite clearly a comment on the sexual liberation of the 60s and social relations. And there's one scene where the Duchess and the brothel madam turn around and say, "This is not a matter of state, this is women's work." It's quite clear. And then, go off to do it and leave the men to sort of go, oh, we don't have anything to do. As a historical source for understanding Europe in the 1960s, I think it's fascinating as well. But then to choose the First World War as its setting raises all sorts of interesting questions.
You can draw a line between the kind of, the film version of Oh, What a Lovely War and that kind of this commentary that this is all mad. Why can you all, the audience, can you not see how incredibly insane all of this is? And, any coincidental comparison to the world we're living in at the moment is purely a matter for the editorial board.
Well, I read it. No, I think one of the latter lines is, "The joke has lasted long enough, we're going to bed," one of the lunatics says as he returns to the asylum. But is it interesting that they what they idealise as being France is sort of 19th century. They don't, is where they seem to want to take it back to, and I couldn't quite put a pin in why they were going back that far. If they were, why were they not recreating the France of 1914? Might not be something we have an answer to.
I think because the France of 1914 is a mess. Literally, the only thing that the French can agree on in 1914 is that, well, the two things they can agree on. Firstly, is that they all hate each other to varying degrees. But the only thing all of these people who hate each other can agree on is that they can probably hate the Germans more. And you end up with this weird kind of fractured mess before the Union Sacrée in 1914. So I'm wondering if they're kind of going back to almost like a Belle Epoque, 19th century, post-Napoleon, post-Bourbon restoration, where it's nuts, but it's fine because it's a peaceful form of nuts. It's before the Franco-Prussian War. It's Carnival, but without the pressure of there being any consequences for it.
It's very explicitly Carnival.
Yeah,
all the imagery, and then the love interest as tightrope walker walking across the town on the wires, which
I loved, absolutely loved.
See, my favourite part was when the three Scottish relief soldiers come in and they see the elephant and they can't understand the madness. It's just too much for them. They can live in the trenches, they can live in the war madness, but what they can't get is the madness of this village, and they throw down their rifles and run off.
Whereas my favourite part was they have so much fun with the Scots and their kilts. Oh my God. And the dancing scene where you've got all the Scotsmen dancing. And all I could think was, do you know the Twitter account Soviet Soldiers Dancing?
Yes, I do.
If you don't, Angus, you have to go and find this. It is just, as a historian of war and masculinity, it is absolute perfection. And that was all I could see. And it has actually a cartoon quality to it. We were, before we started recording, we were talking about Bruce Bairnsfather. You can almost see a Bairnsfather cartoon of these Scotsmen in their kilts dancing in the middle of a French square. I loved that scene. It just made me.
Well, they never just get out one piper when they can have four as well.
So I found during my PhD a cartoon from a French newspaper or French newspaper or something like that of a Scottish soldier having their kilt blown up, and I think I put it in a first draft, kind of basically saying like doing what Marilyn Monroe would do like 50 years later or something like that. And I think my supervisor said, "This is funny, but take it out." But the French, I think, did find Scottish kilts funny. They didn't particularly care about the difference between a Scottish soldier and an English soldier, so they just called them all English. But they found kilts funny.
You touched upon national stereotypes. The Colonel, whose name escapes me in King of Hearts, although he's a Frenchman doing a very peculiar Scottish accent, and I think most of the Scotsmen are actually Frenchmen doing Scottish accents, which is quite peculiar. But he sat there, you go in and see the Colonel, and he sat there with his spored willow pattern bone china saucer and teacup, drinking out of his tea. I mean, it's like it's a box ticking exercise in also almost like Melchett sort of British officer class.
Yes, with his little finger. Yeah.
Little pinky thingy up, yeah.
Can we carry on this nationalist sort of stereotyping to other films?
I don't know about nationalist stereotyping, but music and dancing we can carry over into Dawn Patrol, I think, because there's a lot of singing. It's not dancing so much, sort of running about like schoolboys, particularly at the start, which, again, my war and masculinity antenna went up, and it.
The Jessica Meyer signal is shining into the sky. It's coming from Hollywood in 1938.
Masculinity and age and maturity and boys with toys was very obviously the message there. But we all watched Dawn Patrol again, didn't we? Because these were the two shorter films on the list. So
I went through in chronological order.
You did better than I did. There's an element of, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to watch First World War film this afternoon. This is going to be good. Shall I pick the one that has the same running time as the extended edition of The Lord of the Rings? Or shall I go with one that I can actually watch in between seminars?
But it's funny you should talk about some more classic lines I picked up from the whole idea of being a game. So David Niven's brother, well, it's rather like a game at school when he arrives, and he's wanting to fly and they won't let him fly. And then Niven later on sort of proclaims it's just a big stupid game, but none of us know what it's about and why. Again, you've got this idea of the British referring it to a game. And then again, actually, British sportsmanship comes up in Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, where Theo is being released from his prisoner of war camp. He's sat and had his dinner with Blimp and all the British aristocracy, and he makes some comment about they think it's all a game of cricket, in reference to the end of the war. Recurring themes of the British and games.
Which was definitely a recurring theme of criticism by French soldiers towards the British during the war. That the British just didn't get it. But even in Dawn Patrol, where they then have this massive party and drinking session with the German pilot who got shot down, because it's fine, because he survived, and it turns out that Scotty survived as well. And disrupting that understanding of this as a game as one of the soldiers tries to do out of grief is to ruin the facade. It's to crack the lens. You can drink your way through it if you accept that it's a game.
Yeah, and alcohol was such a huge linking theme as well, because the three Scotsmen who go after Plumpik and King of Hearts, who then proceed to drink quite clearly whiskey and then get told off for being dipsomaniacs because they're seeing bears and elephants in the village. But the sheer amount of drinking in Dawn Patrol was just extraordinary. The cultural reference I was having throughout with that was Journey's End, which of course was itself filmed in this period. We probably could have looked at Journey's End, although it's been remade. So I think that, it's becoming less obscure now, where that idea of the responsible officer, the main trauma of the war being the responsibility of sending young men to their deaths, which is quite clearly changed by the 60s. I was astounded by the amount of alcohol involved.
There'd be a very dangerous drinking game in watching it. Every time they ever drink,
yes.
You ever drink. I mean, you would die long before some of the characters do.
Although the speed with which David Niven gets drunk is also quite impressive.
But the cast in it is amazing.
It's extraordinary.
It's also a peculiar film because it's American funded. Is Dawn Patrol. It's American funded with a British director, a British cast, if we will include it. Flynn has been British. He's not really, but he's Commonwealth. But it's written by two Americans, based on an American memoir that has been rewritten for the film to be about the British Royal Flying Corps. So it's, when I was looking at it, I sort of, well, is it a British or an American film? So I sort of had it in a foot in both camps from that point of view. I made a connection with Colonel Blimp and Dawn Patrol because they're about officers, whereas the two American films, The Big Parade and Wings, are about privates, which I thought was and that might be just happenstance for the way we've chosen the films, but it's an officer's point of view from both those films. Everybody else is sort of Batman, aren't they, in those films?
It does mean you get to have Basil Rathbone being just perfect.
He's superb, isn't he?
And Errol Flynn possibly being the most handsome man to have ever existed, whilst being kind of dapper and juvenile and empathetic and drunk, basically all at the same time.
And having character arc across the film. It is a brilliant, brilliant film. Even as it ticks, it's what we think of it in terms of cliches. And I suspect, if you held it up to, if you were to ask what has changed between the representation of the war in the 1930s and now, and to compare it to 1917, which I know we're going to go on and talk about in a future episode, all those cliches about the officer class versus the ranks and the realism, and what counts as being traumatic. The move on from the responsibility of sending young men to their deaths as the central trauma of the war to what we understand as being the central trauma of the war, of experiencing blood and guts and misery, is quite dramatic. It feels like a cliche. And it's really hard in some ways, actually, to get back into that of just how fresh it must have been, even as a remake, with these incredible actors. But oh my God, it's a good film. I'm very glad I watched it, basically.
Yeah, I was delighted I watched it. There were two things that came. Firstly, the thing that I kept comparing it to in my head, particularly in regards to kind of the drinking and the way that the pilots live their lives, is the book The Right Stuff, about American space pilots, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong and all those guys, who lived a drinking, driving fast lifestyle because, I'm a test pilot. I can drive a car as fast as I want to because I'm a test pilot. Nothing will happen. And if it does happen, it'll happen to another guy who's not as good as a pilot as I am. That kind of addicted to speed element is ripped right through that film because they all get drunk and go on a motorbike drive, which, I mean, it's 1930s technology, so it's not hugely convincing with the superimposed nature of going backwards and forwards for the trucks. But the other thing that struck me is it's a very different film to watch post 1940. That feeling of young pilots on the constant edge of exhaustion, going up every day, new reinforcements coming, and there aren't enough of them, and they don't have any time in the cockpit, and they're going up and they're getting killed, and the veterans are coming back, and then the next wave come in. It's a very different watch after the Battle of Britain, and I wonder how much of its time, that kind of firstly the fear of air power in 1938 after the Spanish Civil War, and that the lead up to the Second World War, how it was received at the time, because I couldn't watch it as if it was in 1938 because I couldn't take the Second World War out of it.
It was really hard, and I kept having to remind myself it was 1938. And then, of course, David Niven does go on to serve in the RAF. So, yeah, I haven't go. He hasn't done this yet.
I had been looking up how young he was because I knew he'd served somewhere. I think he ended up in the Commandos or something. Anyway, I knew he'd served, but I had to look him up. I quite realised how young he was.
I thought he was RAF, or I may be confusing him. Anyway,
one of them. I won't Google it. We'll let the listeners to Google it.
Yeah.
But something else that's interesting about that, I don't think it shows the First World War as being, I would say, futile, something that's to be lost, because they do achieve their goals, though there is loss. If that makes sense. So there's not necessarily a sense of futility in that respect. In Dawn Patrol, they do achieve what needs to be achieved, but it's just bloody.
Yeah, you could compare it to like something like 633 Squadron, where they go and they do what they have to do, and a lot of them are going to die doing it. But it's a job that is worth doing. It's a job that's worth doing well, and it's an outcome that is advantageous to the war effort, despite the fact that we know it's 1915 and it probably isn't.
I don't know, because that's only really true of the solo raid, isn't it? And then you end with Scotto, with Niven's character. He's the third in the line taking on this responsibility, and there'll be a dawn patrol the next morning, and he's sending up Squadron A and Squadron B, and they're just doing it again, and these replacements are going to die just the same.
But they do hold the line. They do. He does bring down the Red. I mean, the Red Baron seems to be a real boogeyman figure in these films. But he downs him, doesn't he?
Well, he's not strictly the Red Baron. He's von Richter versus von Richthofen.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Well, okay.
Yeah, he's an independent character, almost for copyright purposes, by the sounds of it.
Didn't quite pick up on that, right? Yeah.
I mean, there were plenty of Red Baron films, and what we should have done is probably gotten Paul Cook on to talk about the German films about the Red Baron that proliferated in the 1930s. Maybe we can do that in a future episode.
So we should definitely do that.
Chateau Generals come out in Dawn Patrol as well. There's always someone at the other end of the phone that you can just not quite hear. The sound's there because sort of giving out that, no, you've got to do it. You've got to do it. This is... So you get this idea that it's being controlled from a distance. It's
the sound of the teacher from Peanuts, that thing. And they're not going on with a conversation because that noise doesn't stop. Regardless of what Basil Rathbone says on the phone in response to them, they're just not listening. So, I mean, Basil Rathbone does an awful lot with very, very little in that. I mean, at times he's almost eating the scenery, but I'm entirely fine with that.
I'm trying to think how that's representative in Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, because it's obviously slightly different because he's obviously a general at that point, but he doesn't do much but get stuck in his car whilst visiting forwardish units. You don't get quite that presence of where he is with the battlefield.
Well, that's one of the things I remember most about that film is that he never actually gets to the front, right?
And the atrocity that's carried out is by a South African. When he tortures or shoots the prisoners, that guy with the strange accent, South African.
Right.
It's a dreadful accent, and I can't remember if I Googled it or anyway, or it gets alluded to further on. But he's a South African, which I thought was interesting that it's left to someone from the colonies to extract that information out of those prisoners. Because obviously Blimp just thinks they should all be treated well and treated nicely, and he has a friend, and does he know him, and could you, by the way, tell us what's going on? Slips in sort of afterwards, give me another hour of nice chit chat and I'll break him through home comforts. Is John Candy, isn't it?
Yes,
Wing Candy.
Yeah, that's right. It's back to these national stereotypes again. You have the international encounter in all the films we've discussed so far, either as prisoners or as direct enemy in King of Hearts. And the stereotypes are quite broad, a lot of them. I mean, Chris, this is your area of expertise, really. Possibly not the Germans, but...
No, the French ones in King of Hearts, particularly of the French generals and that at the end, I mean, it's very much in keeping with how deeply, deeply weird the whole experience of both being in the film and watching it is. But this kind of... the scene at the end where the French general is rewarding the main... I keep forgetting his name. I keep wanting to call him Pumpernickel. That's the effect. Plumpik. Is rewarding him and his pigeon.
Yes. But it's his pigeon that gets the medal, not him.
It's his pigeon that gets the medal, which is a very kind of... first, it's a very Verdun thing, because I think there's a pigeon called Valiant who is kind of praised for trying to rescue people at Fort Vaux. And I think there's also... Or maybe there's a pigeon called Valiant that also ties in with the American soldiers at some point during the Battle of the Meuse or something. But then all he gives Plumpik is, on behalf of the President of the Republic, is a kiss on each cheek. And it's this kind of intangible, but almost kind of, for the British, like impenetrable Frenchness that is just weird. But of course, that's what he was going to do. There is no higher honour for a Frenchman to give a member of Her Majesty's fighting forces than a kiss on behalf of the President of the Republic and a medal for his pigeon.
Shall we look at Wings, which I have to say is a long film, but for an aviation film, what a fantastic film. I mean, some of the dogfight, if you think about the size of some of these cameras are enormous. And if you read about some of the making of it, how some of the actors had to learn to fly, and they have technicians ducking down so they can film the actors. I mean, it's a triumph of technical filming.
I know there's been quite a lot of work done on, it is as a work of film history, specifically for that reason, that it was such a technical triumph, but also, the cast, again, it's a well-known cast. And I think Clara Bow, for all that it is not a film about intergender relationships, she was the big selling point, apparently. So in a lot of the publicity at the time, they really foreground. You can see in the poster that is most commonly used, that relationship and her role is foregrounded because she was the talking point. She was the best known star, I think, of the four named on the poster, and certainly hers is the biggest name. So there's rather an odd thing going on there with who films are being sold to and on what basis. Because it is a war film, and it's a film about male relationships, which are central to all these war films, being sold on the name and characterization of a woman who's the bigger star at this point, which is, most of what I knew about the film when I came to it originally, having heard some academic papers on the subject.
The love aspect on this and Big Parade is very central to the story, though, which certainly it's not in Dawn Patrol. There's no female characters whatsoever. I don't think there's one at all in the film. And whilst Blimp has, obviously there's that thread all the way through of Deborah Coeur, who keeps appearing in different roles, it's not quite as centre is the love aspect in these two films, which makes me wonder if they're very much more commercial. They're very aimed at, let's get these early films, we need to appeal to everyone more, perhaps, than...
Well, I wonder if these are early enough that audiences haven't been as compartmentalized. They're aiming to get everyone in because that is who the audience is. There isn't an audience for war films. There isn't an audience for romances. There is just an audience. And women were a huge part of the film audience in the US and the UK in the interwar period. So,
and the genre, as you're saying, there isn't an audience. There isn't even really a genre in the way that we would recognise the concept of a war film. I think what you end up is a variety of dramas set in different times and places. It's a drama film set in the First World War, and therefore it's, anybody who wants to go and see it's going to want to go and see it. And even if you take things like, it's not exactly the same thing, but the Battle of the Somme documentary was marketed at everybody in Britain, and everybody in the country went and saw it. There's no compartmentalization of the audience for it, because cinema's still brand new, basically. And that's what I think makes particularly those early films really, really interesting, because they don't have some of the kind of the genre cinematic baggage that changes how we can kind of interpret them, because they're still making it up as they go along.
But the basic story is fairly a well-known story. Two boys love the same girl. One gets the wrong message, kind of thing. And I'm sure there's an element there is an element of Greek tragedy to it, isn't there, in Wings, where the two friends, one of them accidentally shoots down his friend who is flying a German plane because he'd escaped as a prisoner. That just plays out as some sort of, I'm sure there is a Greek tragedy in there somewhere. I just can't figure out. I meant to look them up, Greek tragedy, to see which one it was. It's quite a familiar sort of tale.
Well, it's I don't know about Greek tragedy, but it's certainly the part of the plot of Two Noble Kinsmen, which is Shakespeare, which is based on some classic that it comes out of, it's there in Chaucer's The Knight's Tale and various things. And it's been too long since I've done an English literature course to be able to trace it all the way back.
It's also basically the plot of Pearl Harbor, which is a dreadful film, but is, if we could reconsider it as recreating the very earliest traditions of fighter plane films, which is the likes of Wings and the like, it's treading on well-trod ground just very, very badly.
Now, something I thought about Wings, and I thought the links in the big parade here is Wings is a display of modernity as well. For these are when's the Wright brothers? 20 years old, the flying technology, and they've just got. There's a lot of flying in this film. There's a lot of flying where there's not a lot of plot, but there's a lot of flying, and it looks fab. It looks fantastic, and you get a few over the trench line sort of shots. There must be some of the early aerial depictions, presumably, of what a battlefield from the air might have looked like, because you certainly don't get that feeling in the big parade. It's a very different battlefield that they face.
I love the idea of the producers and that of Wings sat around the table at various points going, okay, we've had this dramatic scene with Clara Bow and the like, and what should we do next? 10 minutes of flying? Cracking, fantastic. 10 minutes of flying it is. And then just repeating that every 15 to 20 minutes.
But there's also the element to which, Wings is defined by or defines American memory of the war, in the sense that it is a film about flight and not about the trenches, which, certainly when I was growing up and learning about the war, if Americans talked about anything about their war experience, and this is in the 80s and 90s, they talked about flying and the escadrille américaine, and this is what the Americans did in the war. They flew, not all the First World War battles that increasingly people are talking about. And that was, for a long time, the popular memory, of the First World War in America, which I think Wings had a huge part to play in that. So, the idea that Hollywood's technical directors have shaped the way in which America remembers the First World War is quite powerful.
Weirdly, it's still part of the way that the French remember the American country. So if you go to like Invalides, the museum shop, which I like to try and spend at least 5 hours in every time I go to Paris, there's nothing in there about the British. Could not care less about the British involvement in either of the two world wars. Tons of stuff on the Americans and loads of stuff on like the Escadrille Lafayette. That kind of concept of Americans helping France before they had to, doing it out of choice, and there being something quite noble about that. And that becomes, you get, books about like the Meuse-Argonne and stuff like that, but that Escadrille Lafayette thing is really present in how the French look at America during the war, and just don't care about anybody else.
But from the Americans' perspective, it's also they excelled in this aspect of modernity. That point that Angus is making, that if the American contribution is based on this new form of warfare, and one which, of course, has the the chivalric associations of single combat, which the trenches and artillery combat doesn't. It's a very powerful way of writing American sociocultural dominance after the war into a cultural narrative that doesn't get bogged down in sort of Versailles and reparations and finance and all sorts of other things.
We can link that single combat and modernity back to the big parade, which is, the big parades. There's three big parades. There's the parade that Apperson sees, which causes him to join up. There's the big parade as they go at the front, and there's the big parade as he returns as a sort of a broken hero. But the big parade as they all go to the front of the American army is really noticeable. They don't march, they don't go on trains. There's just an enormous convoy of trucks with planes swooping over the top. It's almost like some German sort of 1940 invasion of France of modernity and the whole shebang. But then you do have this idea of single combat that they don't really depict trenches. They get, certainly the combat is sort of open woodland, but then they end up in that shell hole, don't they? But then we need a volunteer. We don't send the unit forward. We need a volunteer to go over there and take out the machine gun nest. So again, it comes back to almost that individual. We need the individual to go out and sort this out.
Yeah. So which takes us back to the development of genre, because that then plays out over a century of and the big parade sort of sets some of the narratives for what makes a war film. And you come back to you get to Saving Private Ryan in the end. That the entire plot is around the individual and the saving of the individual and the individual characters who are doing the saving. So
even things like Paths of Glory, we should definitely do an episode on Paths of Glory.
God, I don't want to have to watch Paths of Glory. Is the thing.
I will take any excuse to rewatch Paths of Glory.
Okay. Right, I'll do it for you, Chris.
It's an interesting connection with Private Ryan because, it is it comes back, as we mentioned earlier, camaraderie, small groups of men who are a mixed bunch. So you've got Apperson, war becomes a leveller. So you've got, is it Slim with his ridiculous amounts of chewing tobacco that he seems to hoik up everywhere. The bartender whose name escapes me, and Apperson, but they're all from different stratas of society thrown in it together, and war becomes a levelling effect in Big Parade, which I'm not quite sure is quite, if you look at the two British films, Dawn Patrol, if we're counting that as British, and Blimp, was not really a leveller from that point of view, because the officers remain officers and the men remain Batman. To the point where Blimp leaves the army and takes his Batman as his manservant and butler.
Well, it was the discussion we had about that episode of Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, where the Australian apparently takes his manservant as his Batman, which I don't think is historically accurate. It's turned up again in a detective novel that I'm reading at the moment. So. It is becoming an inaccurate trope, I'm sad to say. But I think actually, it was more common the other way around, that a soldier servant would become a servant after the war, as a neat way of avoiding unemployment.
Downton Abbey springs to mind.
Yes, although that wasn't the First World War, that was South Africa, wasn't it?
Oh, was it? Oh yes, no, yes, you're right, it was, because
we start in Bates is an amputee, a disabled ex-serviceman from South Africa.
Oh, I can see where this is going.
You've avoided watching Downton Abbey. Okay, I'll tell you what.
Yeah, I may have made a critical error.
There's only about 5 seasons to go through.
And really, you only need to watch the 2016 season, the 2014 season, which is set in 1916.
How good's their Wikipedia page?
Well, I'll set you a quiz on all the historical errors that I spotted.
Even if if I get that quiz wrong, I'm going to look like even worse of a historian than I already do. I'm still haunted by the fact I got a First World War question wrong to end the game of Trivial Pursuit in like 2014 once or something like that, which my family occasionally don't let me forget.
I was going to ask about the change in narrative if we start from 26 and go all the way through, because something I noticed was that in 1926, Apperson's a volunteer. By 1966, in King of Hearts, volunteers are conscripted.
Well, it's the old joke of being volunteered, I think. It's an old army joke that actually does turn up quite a lot during the war itself. I always think of that as a particularly British joke, but maybe it has international applications.
You normally do it in a very visual way of that kind of one volunteer step forward, and there's usually one like new conscript or something like that who doesn't understand, and everybody else takes a step backwards as a visual pun, and you just see their feet step backwards and his are the ones left standing forward. It becomes quite a kind of a visual pun that the rest of the group have volunteered him because they're street smart enough to know how this works.
Which is something that I think Colonel Blimp touches on, the idea of the professional versus the volunteer army. A distinction that you don't really get in the others so much. They are all either assumed to be volunteers or assumed to be conscripts, I think.
I always tend to think, that Better Ole sort of there's a point when she sort of points out where we don't like to think of people as conscripts; they're all volunteers. It's a differentiation that people seem to forget. I think the only thing we've not mentioned is the fact that Hitler's in King of Hearts. I can't work out how you fit that one in, but it really did make me chuckle when Herr Hitler gets told to shut up and he's sort of ordered off.
Yeah, it's right at the start where he pops in and wants to talk about his ideology.
But Blimp also comes, it's quite heavy on the fact of Theo leaves because his sons have become ardent National Socialists. So it's, for those films are made in the shadow of, a Nazi socialist Germany, which obviously the other ones aren't, which gives him a certain, you get the idea of a good German and a bad German. Which perhaps you don't in the earlier films when they're all having drinks with the downed German airmen.
And even when the von Richter downs Courtney, he then sends back his helmet and goggles so that they know what's happened. So, honor among enemies. It occurs to me, thinking about these films, and the change across time, which we touched on a little bit, and the fact that there isn't sort of a war genre, but I wonder if there was the distinction between drama and comedy in early films, and none of the pre-Second World War films we look at are in any way, shape, or form a comedy. And I just wonder if that's something that to treat the First World War as something comic, which Colonel Blimp does to some extent, as definitely King of Hearts does. If it needs the Second World War in between for the comedic elements to come out in film.
The film that we didn't look at though I forgot what it's called. The Better Ole, that isn't that a comedy?
I think it is, and because it's based on the Bruce Bairnsfather cartoons, which became a play and I think then becomes a film
with Charlie Chaplin's son in.
Yeah, I hadn't made the connection. Yes, of course.
Sid Chaplin.
What is the Charlie Chaplin film where he's
Shoulder Arms?
Yes, that's a good film.
And if you think there is quite a lot of comedy in that, if you think back to the Big Parade, there's quite a lot of humour in it. It's not a comedy film, but there is quite a lot of humour in it.
Same with Dawn Patrol. There are funny bits in it where, when they're being drunk and comedic. But yeah, I agree. I wouldn't describe it as a comedy film. And I wouldn't necessarily say that they're finding the war funny. It's that kind of the thin line between drama and farce of if you don't laugh, you'll cry aspect. Is there stuff in this film that the audience at the time would have found funny that for whatever reason hasn't translated or hasn't aids in the way that I am consuming it now in 2021? And looking at Dawn Patrol, at times I could almost see the shadow of things that an audience at the time might have found quite funny. because of the 1940 bit, because of the time and how I look at the First World War, I just don't know if it's a lack of humor in the film or a lack of humor in me. There's stuff in there that's going over my head that would have been quite funny to an audience.
Yes, and I suspect that's even more true of the silent films, right? It's such an unusual style of acting to us now, and so different from the sound film that we can't see it in the same way that the audiences then would have done.
Certainly with Big Parade, because it's a film about the army rather than the Air Force, must have been a lot of shared experiences that men who are watching that will have been able to directly somehow relate to, especially presumably the combat scene. It's quite a long scene. Well, it is a big chunk of the film, really, and it's quite graphic. It's not too stilted. It's a good scene when you get there. The point that you have to watch an hour and a half, and wherever the slate pops up saying we're about to go to watch. Oh, heaven's sake.
Ace is something to be learned by the cinema arts.
The other thing that struck me about the Big Parade is the lack of trenches. The interconnecting trench is barely a trench. It's kind of a foot deep wriggle hole that the officer wriggles through to go between shell holes, which I'm not sure if you made it now, the audience will go, that's nonsense. These trenches need to be 8 foot deep with parapets and the whole shebang. And actually, these are just shell holes with tiny little interconnecting ditches.
I think it's Stephen Badsey who's written on the documentary filming, so the filming for the Battle of the Somme, and the extent to which it could or couldn't happen, in the actual trenches, and the long debate about how much of the Battle of the Somme is actually a documentary and how much is reconstruction and made up. Actual trench systems do not lend themselves to being filmed, which is why you get very few trench systems that are properly zigzagged, because you can't have a good tracking shot down a zigzag trench. For exactly the same reasons that you have a zigzag trench, because you don't want somebody shooting you down it. Good military tactics do not make for good filming tactics, apparently.
The lack of trenches stood out for me for a film about infantry warfare. Essentially, and it's not the narrative of what you'd expect, because they're walking through untouched woodland. They're not walking through. Oddly enough, the behind the lines is devastation and blown up houses and has been touched by war. But when they actually get to the front, they sort of walk through that sort of untouched looking wood, don't they? With the Germans actually hidden in vegetation. It's not as if they're sort of entrenched in yards and yards of mud and shut up trees. So it's a different landscape than what you might have expected.
Is that what we would have expected, or audiences then would have expected, though? And it's back to what we know and what we assume now, which sort of is circling back to that question of what makes for an obscure film or not. As we remarked, there are going to be plenty of our listeners out there going, but that's not obscure. Yeah, I know all about that film, with the possible exception of The King of Hearts, which I'm going to recommend all our listeners go out and watch now. It is brilliant.
Yeah, we'll put links on the website because they're all freely available.
Well, the other thing to bear in mind about if you do want to watch King of Hearts on YouTube is put the subtitles on. It becomes a progressively harder watch without them.
Even for the English, actually. The accents are interesting. But I think we have to be quite careful about what we assume we know when we're talking about historical films as, popular culture, because things that we don't assume were popular. I mean, all these films were hugely popular in their day, again, with the possible exception of The King of Hearts. I didn't actually look up what viewing figures were for. We're using the term obscure here because these aren't things that get talked of in the same breath as La Grande Illusion, say. But they're not obscure in the sense that they were enormously popular in their day. And similarly, we can't assume that when we watch them, we're seeing them in any way in the same way as the audiences then.
It's perhaps another episode to say what has made some of the older films weather the test of time. Are some of the films that I remembered, for want of a flim-flam word, better? what makes them more relevant to now? Are the films that are remembered because they're more receptive to how we want to remember the war, being perhaps, say, anti-war? Whereas I'm not sure any of these, with the exception of King of Hearts, you could exactly put a pin in and say these are anti-war films.
Well, that's back to the Journey's End debate, because Sherriff always, for a long time, people have said that Journey's End is an anti-war play / film, mainly play. And Sherriff always said that was never how he wrote it, which was the point that Rosa Maria Bracco made in her analysis of it. And the other thing is, I suspect at earlier points in the 20th century, Wings certainly and Dawn Patrol would have been more popular and well known than they are now. And these things go in waves, right? There'll be moments when things are in some ways better known than others, and then they fall out of fashion.
Even down to things like, we've been joking about how long some of the films are, but no, I don't think an audience today is going to sit down and watch a 3-hour-long First World War film unless they're very, very invested in it.
But the flip side of that is you can find all of these on archive.org or on YouTube, whereas 10 years ago, actually finding them and watching them would have been incredibly difficult.
I noticed King of Hearts hadn't had very many views. I was quite surprised.
Well, I think that is this is quite an obscure film.
It's an exceptionally good copy on YouTube that someone's put on. They've gone to the bother of getting the aspect ratio right. It looks fabulous, and it's only had, I have in my head it was 3,000 views or something. I was quite surprised how low it was.
Well, before we started recording, I think I said that one of the top comments on that video is it's like watching an acid trip. But it's like, yeah, that's an audience member who's gone through the whole experience.
Well, it struck parallels with someone who's watched The Prisoner and tried to sort of relate it to the First World War in sort of the aesthetic look, and sort of quite hard to put a pin in on what's going on.
Well, I'm now getting on YouTube, I'm now getting recommendations for all of Alan Bates's films. So...
Well, that's not necessarily
This is not necessarily a bad thing, except that I'm supposed to be starting teaching next week, and I have quite a lot of lesson planning I'm supposed to be doing.
So, do you think we can put the topic to rest?
Yes, with either an if or a but, in that I think there are probably some other films that we should probably look at some undefined point in the future. I think we should do a Journey's End episode.
And a non-obscure film episode.
Well, yes. I think we are planning on doing a 1917 episode, aren't we?
Yeah, I think at least one. I think we've had a suggestion for an idea about 1917 and its portrayal of landscape, which I think would make for a really interesting episode. Unfortunately, as of yet, none of the production team have replied to any of our increasingly desperate emails to speak to us. But yeah, I think there's definitely legwork in 1917. I really very, very much do not want to have to watch War Horse. So if we could avoid that for the time being, that would make me very happy.
But a Journey's End episode would be good. And I know we want to speak to Helen Brooke at some point in the future about theatre in the war. So a theatre film combination would be good fun.
And a Bairnsfather episode, I think, would be quite good.
There's lots to do. So call out to all our listeners once again. If you have a topic, get in touch. We'd love to talk to you. Please.
And what's the account on Twitter?
It's at OWAL Podcast.
And we'll put the link in the show notes, right?
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much. I'll speak to you next month.
Thank you.
Bye.
Indeed. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Comfort, Richard, how can we spend the Bolivian? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.